Hey, this is Dino. Today I want to show you OAuth token dispensing in Apigee using the password grant. So a password grant is covered in RFC 6749, the OAuth spec. This is standard that describes how systems can dispense tokens, and there are a number of different grants. Actually, the implicit grant has been dis-recommended, but all the other grants are still commonly used. And the password grant is one of them. This is used when the resource owner, that's a person, has a password and wants to authenticate to an authorization server, and they send in their username and password credentials. The required parameters inbound are grant type, username, password, and the scope can be optional. This is what it looks like in HTTP. We send in a payload, a form encoded payload like that. Grant type has to be password, username and password have to also be passed. And then also I want to call your attention to the authorization header. This is the HTTP basic authentication encoded client credentials. So the client credentials go in the header, the user credentials go in the form body, and we post that to a token endpoint, and we should expect to get a token back. So this is really easy to implement in Apigee. Now, Apigee is an API platform. It is not an identity provider. So what we normally would do is delegate validation of the user credentials to some external system. What I've got here is an API proxy that implements password grant tokens, token dispensary in two different ways. One, it will use a local mock user database to validate the user credentials, and the other, it will use a remote user database. Both of them do basically the same thing. The local user database is really just a list of usernames and hard-coded passwords, and basically validating that the user credentials is just a check to see, well, does the user exist, and if it exists, does the password match what's passed in? And really, this, you should never do this in production. I'm only doing this for an illustration to show what a password grant would look like within Apigee. So that's the local authentication of the user credentials. And what the proxy looks like, I should say, that's one part of the proxy's operation. There's some other kind of niceties that I put in here. For example, verifying that the grant type passed in is password, otherwise we send back a fault. This is the policy within Apigee that validates that user that I just showed you. Then sending back a fault if the user is not authentic, and then finally using the OAuth generate access token policy to generate a password grant token. And that configuration looks like this. So we can specify the expiry, the refresh token expiry, the supported grant type, and then any additional attributes we would like to attach to that token. So that's really nice. And let me just show you what this looks like. So we'll go to the Trace tab, we'll turn this on, and we will flip over to my terminal window, and we'll invoke this. So what we want is this endpoint, it's password and token. So that's the URL. And what do I need to pass? I need to pass the client credentials. So that's the client ID, which I've previously set, and the client secret. That'll give me a HTTP basic authentication authorization header with the client credentials. And then the other thing I need is the form payload. So that's going to be grant type equals password and username, something valid. How about at apigee.com, and my password for this demonstration is I love APIs. Okay, so that's the full form, and that's going to be a post. So we'll run that, and you'll see, yep, I've got my access token back. This is a password grant access token. It is now good for service for any of the API products approved for this app. So if I flip back over to the trace window, you can see what happened. We received the inbound. This is where the client credentials are passed. This is the payload. We do the checking, the validation of the inbound grant type. This is the JavaScript step that validates this username and this password against that hard-coded list. And then we skip this fault because that actually succeeded. This is the OAuth policy that issues the token, and then we just sort of groom that token and change things around. We can reformat that. You can see in the response there's a whole lot of information. You may not want to dispense all of that back to the calling application. So the groom step that I included in there allows me to add additional properties or strip properties out of this response. What I wanted to do was add in kind of human readable ISO time strings for when the token was issued, when the expiry is, and so on. So that's just for diagnostics and assistance. You don't need to include all that stuff. Okay, so that's the password grant. And it does use, as I said, that local data store. But let me look at a different option. So we've got this endpoint that uses the local data store. We've also got a separate one that uses a remote store. And rather than using a JavaScript call that just looks in a local database, this one uses a different policy in Apigee called service callout, which really just sends an additional HTTP request out. In my case, I have a remote user authentication system. And when I post the username and password, it's going to validate that and send me back a response. So basically, we're just substituting this remote call for that prior local JavaScript call. And the way I do that is just by invoking a different endpoint. Instead of /token, it'll be /token2. And you can see I get a very similar response. It's basically doing the same thing. Apigee has done the work that I just described. And we'll see this was the local verification. That was the initial request that I sent in. This is the second request, and it's calling out to that remote system, sending a post, sending the credentials, and this is what we got back from that remote system. It's not a standard IDP. You could include a standard IDP in this place. This one is not. It's just something I wrote up, just a mock sample user authentication system. And I send back some information about the user. I'm not sending back a token. This service does not send back an ID token, a JWT. It's just a list of claims about a user. But once we get that successfully authenticated, then again, Apigee can generate the password grant token and attach metadata associated to that user, like the name of the user that was authenticated, the grant type, maybe user roles that were asserted by that external IDP, and so on. So this token that gets issued can then be used by the client app, sent into Apigee later, and Apigee can very rapidly verify and validate that token in order to decide whether service should be granted on subsequent API calls that might use other upstream systems, that might target other upstream systems. So that's it. That's how you can implement password grant OAuth dispensing in Apigee. Let me know if questions.